Hello, I'm Andy Schmuckler. This is A Man on a Mission. That's me. My mission is of one piece, but you could describe it as both trying to preserve American democracy over the last generation plus, as I've seen the force of fascism rising. But I understand that in the context of a mission I've been on for a lot longer, which has got to do with trying to provide an understanding that might help human civilization survive on this planet, which I think is a toss-up whether it will. So I feel kind of driven to accomplish getting this, what I call a better human story, uh, into the thinking of our civilization, which is I'm swinging for the fences, and it's not clear that I think I get wood on the ball and the various media in which I write. But in terms of getting this out there where it could do something of benefit, it's a real uphill battle, which I've been engaged in for a long time. And I'm hoping that there's some people listening who are serious about wanting to understand what's going on in the world, because I've devoted my life to it, and I think I got something that might matter. But I'm not sure that people will believe that. It could be this guy. Well, who the hell does he think he is? Yeah, I understand that. So that's one reason why I always start off these things by talking about something um, where it's easier to evaluate whether this guy has got his head screwed on straight or not. And the other thing is, I'm not sure that in our current civilization, I've wondered about this for a long time. I think we don't strive to have a big picture understanding of things. That our inclination is to get into the particulars and the concrete, and not to see it in a broader perspective. Um, and that's another reason why I start out these things talking about stuff closer to home, stuff closer to what I can see from what I read and what I see on MSNBC. This is the stuff that people are talking about and thinking about. So let me start off with something which is a little bit bigger picture than what I usually do, which I'll get to in a minute. I'm going to talk about something about the state of the battle and what we might look for in between now and election day in terms of how democracy, the forces of democracy and the rule of law and maintaining the American system, how they're going to fight this battle against the fascist force that is represented by Donald Trump, and which is imbuing one of our two major political parties. It's really a showdown that's of importance. And I've got some thoughts and some questions about where we go from here. Here we are, April 1st, and the election is on November, what is it, the 5th? Um, I've been thinking a lot strategically, and there are a lot of questions too. I do think that we have to go all out. I'll just say that. And I have been of the belief, which I've put out in previous videos, that the campaign really can't wait till after the national conventions and Labor Day and the stuff that's traditionally how a political campaign is conducted. I mean, I know that everybody's always campaigning, but I think this campaign needs to begin in earnest, because a lot of Americans need to learn a lot and have a lot of their not so well-founded pictures of what our situation is here in America revised in some substantial ways. That's not usually so necessary, at least in my experience. And just to tell you how old I am, I've been following American politics pretty closely since 1956, the year that Eisenhower beat Stevenson the second time around. And JFK was almost Stevenson's running mate at the convention, but they gave it. Anyway, I've been looking for a long time, and this campaign is different. I mean, the 2021, you could tell there was a whole lot at stake. Um, I mean, Donald Trump had already shown us a whole lot about who he was. But until after the election, we didn't know that there was no line at all that he wouldn't cross. He wasn't indicted. He hadn't tried to do an insurrection. So, but this time, it's quite clear that we're in a battle between democracy and fascism, and it is a significant showdown in what has been my focus for, depending on how you look at it, like the early 90s, I saw something about the fascistic propagandists, but I didn't understand that this was really the avant-garde of turning the Republican Party into a force of fascism. But in 2004, I saw that, and I've been engaged with that ever since, on the radio and in my op-eds I send out to this Trumpy area I live in, and basically trying to awaken liberal America to this huge danger that we face. And by the way, in terms of what kind of evidence is there that this big picture that I say I have to offer might actually have an impact on how things unfold? Well, because of the way I've been looking at the human world since my early 20s, which is more than half a century, I was able to see something rising, and much of the good guys of America somehow couldn't see what was coming, what was happening. They thought it was politics as usual. They talked about their friends across the aisle. But I could see that something had changed, and that the battle had become more fundamental. That it was really becoming a battle over the survival of basically the kind of government that our founders gave us in a huge leap forward for humankind when they wrote the Constitution, imperfect though it is. It helps to see the big picture, because then you can see how things are connected. And if you see how things are connected, then you're able to put Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich and Fox News and Karl Rove and across the board obstructionism and torture memo back in. You put them together and you get a picture of there's something coherent here. But anyway, I want to talk about the state of the battle in a few minutes, because a lot of people are getting very deeply into this. I mean, if you watch MSNBC right now, they are full-time really talking about this situation in terms of trying to get its audience activated to understanding that this is a battle between democracy and fascism. And they keep on going at it from one angle after another. Some of it's really very worthwhile. Some of it's, I find, a bit repetitive and tiresome. But they're out there doing it. I mean, liberal America, and even Joe Biden, who's basically Mr. Let's work together in a spirit of goodwill and cooperation. I mean, that's who he really wanted to be. That's who he is by nature. But even he is talking about Trump as a threat to American democracy. So how do we do this between now and Election Day? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But first, I want to start with the thing I put on the title of this: 3 countries whose right-wing political parties may be headed toward collapse. I can't see the title right now. But basically, there have been 3 countries that I've been following. Well, I've been following their politics actually very closely in the case of the UK, since Brexit was coming to the fore, which is back in 2016. I mean, I knew a little bit about what was going on in Britain, but I started following it closely, and particularly when that self-inflicted catastrophe of Brexit got passed in 2016, months before we inflicted our own catastrophe on ourselves, and at the end of 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, I started following UK politics pretty closely. for a long time looking at it every day. Nowadays, it's probably more like 3 times a week. I go to Google News UK and I look to see what's going on. So at that. And since about the same time, I've been following Israeli politics very closely. You can look on Saturday. I did a video called "Can the Netanyahu regime in Israel be toppled?" And you know, I think if you go there, you can see that I've been paying attention to that, and I've been very unhappy with both of those countries. But of course, the main country I've been paying attention to is the United States. I'm an American boy, lived here all my life, tend to live out here. But if Trump gets elected, I don't know what I'd do. Anyway, this is my country, and I'm fighting for it full time. I ran for Congress here against one of the Republican purveyors of falsehoods back in 2012. Lost, of course. I mean, it was a 2-to-1 electorate. Basically, the Republican electorate had been already turned into something really difficult to penetrate. I found it impossible to penetrate. Maybe I moved 1 or 2%, but I had watched how with W they had systematically taught their followers, don't pay attention to anybody but us. If it's a Democrat or a liberal, obviously don't pay any attention to that. If it's a journalist, well, it's right-wing bias. I mean, liberal bias. Eventually it became fake news. And the scholars, you know, the people who study, who can actually tell you something, don't pay any attention to them. Or the scientists, I mean, when it comes to climate. It was already something wedded to the lie, and so I ran against it. And I couldn't, I'm a big believer in the power of the truth, and the history of our country and over the past generation has called me to question some of my assumptions about how powerful the truth is and how weak the lie is. It's been disturbing to me to see how much the ground the lie has gained since the America I grew up in. I mean, if you look at what a lot of people over there in conservative America believe, I mean, it's just permeated with falsehoods. How did that happen? Well, I have a lot to say about how that happened, and it has to do with it being a systemic problem. That there was a weakness and a blindness on the side of truth and democracy that got in the way of defeating this thing that was rising. You know, if you look at what is this thing, well, there is some meaningful sense in which you can see a thing, but you have to go to the big picture to get an idea, or a bigger picture, to get an idea of that you're actually dealing with a thing. You could see it starting to make big inroads into the Republican Party toward the end of the first Bush presidency. You can actually look back into the Reagan presidency, and you can see that there were some elements in it that were of a certain spirit. Oliver North and that whole gang with the Iran-Contra thing. There was a lawlessness that appeared there, and a sanctimonious phoniness like Oliver North showed in his testimony to Congress. It was already part of the picture, but you could see, well, I could see, it was in the early 90s that I saw something that troubled me, and it had to do with the 20 million ditto heads that Rush Limbaugh was pouring poison into their ears for 3 hours a day. It helps to see the big picture. But there are all kinds of levels, and they are all related to each other, which makes for a very interesting, coherent picture. The American rise of fascism is part of a bigger picture in which the right has been taken over by not their best selves. You know, like if you look at the UK, and you see what David Cameron did, which led to the Brexit disaster, and you see what Boris Johnson did. I mean, this is not a party worthy of respect, the Conservative Party. It has led Britain or the UK. I don't like. I like calling it. I don't want to call it England. I don't like to say UK. I'm more of a fan of Britannia. But I mean, I've watched it become a country I'm no longer able to look at and say, I really like the kind of shape it's in. I'm an Anglophile from way back. I really admire Winston Churchill, and British movies have been a meaningful part of the feeding of my heart and soul. I have loved entering into the world that gave us Shakespeare and Dickens and stuff like that. And I hate to see what this Conservative Party has done to Britain. They of the three right-wing forces that I'm going to talk about, Britain's Conservative Party is the least dark and evil compared to what's happened on the Israeli regime and what's happened to the Republican Party as it became the Trump Party. But even if it's not, I mean, somebody like Sunak, who's the current prime minister, he's not a bad guy. I mean, he's no Trump. He's not a sociopath like Netanyahu either. He's okay. But the Conservative Party has just given them a ride into disaster with a whole bunch of lousy decision making, starting with dealing with the financial crisis in a way that was very destructive and unnecessary and caused a lot of human suffering. And all the way to last week, there's a headline in the UK that the feelings of the people of the United Kingdom about their National Health Service are worse than they have ever been. And that's just an example of a lot of damage has been done because of this right-wing force being in power in the UK. But the polling is suggesting that the Conservative Party, if there were elections held now, the Conservative Party that wiped the table, wiped everybody off the table back in, I think it was 2019, getting 300 and whatever 80 seats in Parliament. I mean, a majority with a lot of room to spare. From that level of popularity, if the election were held now, they would get less than 100 seats, less than a third, maybe less than a quarter of what they got just 5 years ago. And it looks like the UK may be heading toward that election. I don't know the Labour Party, which would form the next government if everything goes as it looks like, is led by a guy named Keir Starmer or something like that. And he seems okay, but I can't say that he's shown me anything to make me think that he could use this opportunity with any kind of a masterful hand, which would be really good for the UK if it could get itself a really first-rate leader for recovering from what the Conservative Party has done to the country. But still, there'll be some kind of a turnaround, and one could wish them well. I still have this real fondness for the English, for the Irish, for the Scots. I don't know the Welsh all that well, but my wife and I, we watched The Crown. We watched Downton Abbey. there's just a lot that that nation has given us, including the English language, of which I'm very fond. So there is one place where it looks like the sun may soon rise. It's been a dark time, but more a time of pure opportunism, irresponsibility, a certain amount of dishonesty and scandal, some hypocrisy, but not really, like outright malevolence. And then we go to Israel, where I have spoken a bunch about this whole Israel situation with Gaza and this particular regime being in power. And I speak as one who loves Israel, believes in its right to exist, and hates that it's now being led by its worst selves. Its worst, just like having America led by Donald Trump makes you cringe to have that be the one that's calling the plays on the world stage. So I feel that way about having this fascist outfit headed by a sociopath willing to sacrifice his country to serve his own need to hold on to power to stay out of jail. I mean, it's really not been pleasant to contemplate. And it's starting as soon as it looked like Netanyahu is going to be indicted for crimes of corruption. I kept on looking for the fall of Netanyahu. And it was a nice year when there was 1 year where he's been out of power over the last, whatever it is now, 15, 16 years. 2022, he was out of power. And even though it was such a strange group of people forming a coalition just to keep him out of power, even though they went from pretty far right wing to pretty far left wing and Arab, they formed a coalition to accomplish things on which decent people could accomplish something, even though they disagreed about major things having to do with how to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian issue, for example. But they got some good things done. It was a nice break. But then Netanyahu got back into power, and he got back into power. He had alienated so many people who were decent conservatives, the kind of people who formed that 1 year coalition, that the only way he could form a coalition that had a majority in the Knesset was to bring into the mainstream, and not only into the mainstream, but giving essentially a controlling interest, just like you can see the Republicans have the worst Republicans have a controlling interest about the House of Representatives Republicans. He brought people into the government who are basically Jewish Nazis, as far as I'm concerned. Smotrich, on the head of I think the Shas party, and a guy named Ben Kavir, who is convicted of a certain kinds of extremism. And these are guys that any previous Israeli government would have regarded as, we don't include those kind of Nazis. Just like the first George Bush when he was president, and David Duke, former Grand Wizard or still Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, won the Republican nomination for some, I think it was in Louisiana, and George W. Bush basically said, this is, the Republican Party repudiates him. Now, of course, they don't repudiate anything too extreme in terms of racism or other forms of fascism. There's nobody too far to the fascist for this Republican Party to embrace it and even subordinate itself to it in the form of Donald Trump and in the form of the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party. I mean, any decent political party would say, I mean, especially the party that's supposed to be the heir of what we have always called the Republican Party. The idea that you would sacrifice American national interest by withholding uh, aid from Ukraine when it is quite clear to everybody who understands what the dynamics are about Putin, who hates America, and his aggression into Ukraine, and what our interest is here, and what a bargain it is that we're able to achieve so many of our interests and that of our Western European allies against this fascist dictator in Russia who's been acting like our enemy for a long time. Well, that's what's been in power in Israel. And there are a variety of things going on about whether or not that regime can be toppled. And it's the place where I feel that Biden has made the biggest mistake of his presidency, actually. I'm a big Biden fan. Biden is our champion, but I think he should have separated himself from this regime as soon as it became obvious that they were taking our arms but ignoring everything that Biden wanted them to do. Just token gestures in the direction of, yeah, well, we'll be a little bit humanitarian. Not, not something an American president should have been supporting. But the whole nightmare that Israel's gone through immediately showed a huge swing in the public opinion polls. So it has been obvious that as soon as the Israeli people have an opportunity to dump Netanyahu and this whole coalition, I think, yeah, pretty much, that they will seize that opportunity and they will hand power to the opposition, which will probably be headed by a guy named Benny Gantz. And I don't have a real clear notion of exactly where he would lead Israel, but it would clearly be a significant departure from some of the fascistic spirited things that you can see from the Netanyahu government. He makes noises occasionally that indicate that he is separate from this government, and something has happened just lately where he has come out strongly in favor of a major shift in the relationship legally between the ultra-Orthodox and the rest of Israeli society. This has been an emerging issue in Israel as the proportion of young men, Israeli young men who are of that very, very Orthodox, full-time study of the Torah kind of people, a concession that got made to just 1% of Israelis back in 1948 or 9, whenever they set all this up, said to this 1%, you guys can just do your thing. We're not going to ask you to do what everybody else in the country has to do. When they turn 18, they got to go and give 3 years of their life to military service. Because Israel is a country that has only been able to survive because it has developed a society in which it is fully understood that everybody's got to sacrifice to protect the country, the nation, in a very hostile world, which they've had even after they became mighty, surrounded by really bigger powers than it seemed like they could possibly withstand. Even after they became more the Goliath that was able again and again to defeat what looked like a Goliath of Arab forces. It was it required that people be willing to sacrifice. But meanwhile, the demography of the country changed from 1% to 12 or 13% are these the young men that are coming up in these big families are the people who dress a certain way and spend all their days over the Torah and discussing it and learning it and having their religious studies, which they believe, in at least some of them apparently I've read, they really believe they're contributing to national security because of their piety and their relationship with God. But the rest of the society doesn't see it that way. They see that, okay, now we've got 12 or 13% of our people. That's too much to ignore. And particularly right now, at a time when over 500 of these Israeli young people have lost their lives in pursuing the Netanyahu gang's way of conducting this war, which I think is a major blunder, by the way. But the rest of the society has lost patience with that. Not only are these Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, exempt from military service, but these religious studies guys actually get subsidized, and their education gets subsidized by the government. And these people emerge with like an education in the religion and a full-time stipend to pursue the religion, which they're getting supported for by the rest of society, not all of whom think that that's giving them what they value. And particularly when you've got people, families, paying a big price for what these people are benefiting from the armed forces that protect their freedom in a hostile world. But they're not having to sacrifice like everybody else. Well, this was an issue that the Israelis were supposed to deal with. And I mean, the Supreme Court had laid down some kind of a requirement, which by coincidence, just this past week, was the government was supposed to achieve something which had to do with eliminating the discrimination. I don't know the details of exactly who had to do what, but the thing is that the Netanyahu government has not yet. I think today is the day they were given an extension to implement or propose or something. This is how it's going to be about drafting the Haredim, the yeshiva bucher. This is how it's going to be, and it satisfies what the court said we needed to do. And by coincidence, I think the date that was given 3 or 4 years ago for the government to solve this problem happens to coincide with this moment in history where the reality of the sacrifice is available in everybody's lives. Their friends, children, or children of friends, or whatever. People who've lost their own sons and daughters, and whose sons and daughters are still in harm's way, and who have been missing from their jobs because the reservists got all called up. I mean, this is a big thing, and they're tired of subsidizing the people who've had it good. Well, this creates a problem for Netanyahu and his gang, at least according to some of the writings. I'm not sure how real this danger is, because it's got to do with people leaving the coalition that keeps Netanyahu's gang in power, either losing one piece of it or another piece. There being a no-win solution available. That if Netanyahu does what the law requires him to do, the Haredim, who are part of, who are the extremists on the far Nazi right of his coalition, will scream bloody murder and bring the government down by withdrawing from the government in protest. Would they do that? I mean, but people say that they might, I don't, I mean, there's a psychological issue. I mean, if it was me, I would think I'm trapped here. If we have new elections, Netanyahu's the only guy who would ever bring us into a government because he was desperate to stay in power. But we aren't going to be able to get back here again if we bring the government down. But they say that it's a danger. And then on the other side, they say that if he appeases that pampered 12 or 13% that the secular, I don't know, is it a majority in Israel that's secular? But anyway, they're more secular than these guys, and they don't want to be doing this. And if he appeases them again, because this issue has been causing stress in Israeli society for many years now, maybe a generation, increasingly. They say that the more moderate members of Netanyahu's own party, which is Likud, would withdraw from the coalition and bring down the government. There would be those new elections, and we would be able to kick this Netanyahu regime and Netanyahu himself off and the disaster that they've brought onto Israel, one way and another. And I won't go into the various dimensions of what looks damaged in Israel right now, but this has really been I mean, the damage done to the UK, was it as serious as the damage that this group has done to Israel? I don't think so. I mean, it's kind of hard to compare, a country that's sort of falling apart like the UK with a country in which the rolling coalition really tried to establish an authoritarian regime with what was called judicial review. So even before this war, there was a clearly fascist move going on. And I really like to see that the polls say that if an election were held now, Netanyahu's Likud party would get half the seats it's got now. A wipeout, magnitude comparable maybe to the conservatives. Well, maybe not quite that big. But a wipeout with Benny Gantz getting 34 seats in the Knesset on his way. All he needs is 61, and there would be plenty of other parties of a decent nature that he could form a coalition with, and he would be Israel once again being governed by the better angels of its nature. At least that's my hope. Can't say that I see deeply into the mind and heart and soul of Benny Gantz, but what I have seen gives me bases for hopefulness. So that's two countries, and then we come back to the United States, where we've got something happening in our politics that I don't think anybody in the America I grew up with in 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. It begins to change in the 1990s. One thing I say is that the Republican Party has not treated a Democratic president as if he was a legitimate person in that office, the guy that the American people hired to do an important job. That hasn't happened with the Republican Party since 1976. Jimmy Carter got elected, the Republican Party was still a normal party, and they accepted that was, okay, this is America. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. The game is legitimate. The American people wanted to give Jimmy Carter a crack at being president. Okay, well, we'll deal with him as president. But then you get 12 years after Carter, who, wonderful man, not really all that capable of performing the presidency with good effect. But he was one of the most wonderful people ever to occupy the. As a human being, you can see that in his post-presidential life. I mean, Habitat for Humanity, really a great person. But then we had 12 years of the Republicans, and then the first Bush lost to Clinton in '92, and for the first time since Carter in 1993, a president takes office, and the Republican Party never dealt with him as a legitimate president. The right-wing propagandists were on the radio filling people's minds with poison about, they didn't say he wasn't eligible to be president like they did with Obama. What they said was that he was a serial killer back in Arkansas and various other attempts to take this guy, who was really quite brilliant in my opinion, and also kind of sleazy. There was some problem with Bill Clinton at a moral level, which turned out to be his undoing. Even though he knew that they were out to destroy him, he didn't have the discipline to make absolutely sure he didn't provide them with the means of destroying him. Anyway, so that was Clinton, but they tried to pin on him some kind of financial scandal with Whitewater, and when that didn't work, Ken Starr, who was the Grand Inquisitor of hypocrisies, he goes looking for a blue dress with a stain on it that would expose that this president was somewhat sleazy in terms of how he dealt with his sexuality. Nothing. But the American people, as it turned out, didn't like what the Republicans did to Clinton. They overplayed it. They had demonized him probably fairly successfully, but making such a big deal out of what happened between Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky, I mean, the country doesn't need to magnify something like that, If you look through the pages of the history of the American presidency, if you just go back as far as JFK, I mean, don't we have some pretty sordid stuff that we know about JFK and the Secret Service ferrying women in and out of the White House? Okay, but we've had presidents whose character had defects. But they were also very capable presidents who took their responsibilities seriously. But the Republican Party had already become something that wasn't willing to play by the rules anymore. It wasn't willing to say that if there's an election and we lose, the results that benefit our opponents are just as valid and are just as much requiring of respect from the rest of the political system as when we win. That's the rule. But already the Republican Party, by the time Clinton's 8 years in office, it was no longer willing to say, well, this guy may be sleazy. Paula Jones may have a case. But that's not our business here in politics. Our business is to work with the person that the American people hired. And if there are things about it that are not to our liking, we'll try to replace it with something better the next time there's an election. That's how we're supposed to play. But the Republican Party hasn't played that way since Jimmy Carter. That was a sign of a kind of lawlessness. So this was rising on the right for quite a while. And it was making possible by its success, moving ever further in that kind of a direction. So that in 2015, you had a Republican base that could look at somebody like Donald Trump, who's exactly the kind of person the guys on Mount Rushmore would tell us. You can't give this kind of a person the powers of the presidency. I mean, any one of a number of character defects that were visible in Donald Trump should have set off alarm bells that this is what, George Washington would say, no sane people will hand presidential powers to a guy like this, so selfish, so greedy, so contemptuous of the rules and the norms, so dishonest, so in it only for himself. Already something had changed, and it's taken the other side a very long time to recognize what's been rising for 30 years. This is not the same the spirit driving today's Republican Party is really quite extraordinary. And the extraordinariness is you can say of it that it meets this definition, a coherent force that consistently works to make the human world worse. And then you look at everything they do and say, and you can say, yeah, really quite consistent. The impact of what they do is almost always to make things more broken. You can't find any place anymore where what the Republican Party is doing or saying is making things better than if they hadn't even been there. Quite consistent. That's a big picture. That's a clue to something big picture. What accounts for that consistency? Anyway, if you have a coherent force that's consistently working to make things worse, I propose that characterizes how Western civilization has generally conceptualized something that was named a force of evil. So if you had something like that, and I think you can see that we do with this exceptional Republican Party, it would be appropriate to relate to it as a force of evil. If the name was disturbing, but I mean, it acts that way. It operates that way. It showing the coherence and the interconnections of showing that there is a force. That's part of what I claim to do. But anyway, the Republican Party is a convergence of various forces that make it collectively what I'm calling a force of fascism. Almost everything about fascism versus democracy is about fascism making things worse and democracy making things better. I mean, I could go through, some of the ways in which you can say that human well-being is so much better served in a system like our founders set up than in a system like Putin's got. And taking that, really the fundamental difference is that democracy is power from the bottom up, which is what an election is supposed to accomplish. And it's way characteristic of fascism to show what it's about. When the fascist loses an election, he tries to overturn it. Top down. Hitler is top down. Putin is top down. Orban in Hungary is top down. Xi in China, more ambiguous situation about fascism, but I use it. But that's what we're up against here in America, a force that we can characterize in certain ways that have clear indications of its being making the world worse. I mean, racism makes the world worse. Greed makes the world worse. The lust to dominate makes the world worse. Cruelty and hatred make the world worse. A lack of integrity and consistent use of deception and manipulation make the human world worse. All the way up and down the line, you can see that there is something that moves through the human world. Anyway, we're up against some of that right now with Donald Trump, with his racism and his fascism, and his eagerness to violate any kind of norm or law he can, and his eagerness to get his hands on American law enforcement so he can weaponize that against his enemies. Just like he tried to weaponize American aid in getting in weakening Zelensky against our real enemy, Putin, whom he adores, apparently. Does something anyway. Yeah, we're up against something that looks like that. We're up against a Republican Party in the House that shows some really important things about what spirit that party is run by, that a relative few who would like to block aid to Ukraine can block aid to Ukraine because they say no. They've got themselves a speaker who seems to be happy to say no. And the majority, a big chunk of more moderate, whatever the word is, Republicans, if the bill ever came to the floor, a whole lot of Republicans would vote to get aid to the Ukraine. It's just a matter of getting it to the floor. You need the Speaker of the House to do that, unless you can get some other petition, discharge petition. And they're trying to do that. But anyway, a small group of pro-Putin Republicans is able to dictate what the whole party will do, which tells you what's in control of the party. Trump at the level of the presidential nominee, and all that you could say about what Trump is showing increasingly openly, vicious and lawless and contemptuous of everything that would ever hold him accountable, and willing to wield political violence, just like Germany had brown shirts that patrolled the streets in the early 30s, beating up people. We've seen this spirit before. And the Ukraine thing is really substantial to look at this in the big picture. That we've got a force of fascism at work in the world. I don't really understand how this globalization of the problem has taken place, but it's clear that democracy has lost a lot of ground in a variety of countries over the last 20 couple years. Certainly in the United States, certainly in Israel, certainly in Turkey and India and Brazil. I don't understand how all this happened, but you can see that there is a global nature to the fight that we're fighting. And I'm not sure exactly how much that should enter into how we conduct our arena of the fight, which is this election in 2024. I am very optimistic that this election can be one in which the Trumpy fascist force that's been cultivated for a generation gets practically a knockout blow. I don't know that it could be more of a blowout, potentially, than just a defeat. There would be a power to a defeat of the magnitude that I believe is possible. I'm not I'm not sure that I'm right, that you could get 2/3 of Americans to repudiate fascism this November. I can see that possibility, but what do I know? It feels right from what I've looked at how people have voted, like on anti-abortion in Kansas. And this election lately in Alabama after the IVF thing, where a Democrat in a somewhat red district won by 25%. I think there are people who are ready to move if they can get something vivid enough in front of their eyes. It seems as though a lot of people in Kansas who vote Republican, what did it get? Almost 60%, something defeating something that the MAGA Republicans were trying to do about abortion and the Kansas Constitution. 60-40 almost. It gets defeated in Kansas. Kansas isn't even a purple state, is never in play. A lot of Republicans repudiated what their Republicans in the legislature were trying to do. Well, that was over the issue of abortion. I don't know how the people of Alabama in that district that swung so far to a Democrat. I don't know exactly what they were thinking and seeing about what happened with the Alabama Supreme Court saying that a frozen embryo is a child, which put a lot of people in an untenable position. A lot of people who, unlike with abortion, actually wanted to have children. And it had nothing to do with sex or misogyny, because these are couples that want to have children and for whom sex didn't work. Something about that decision didn't sit well with a lot of people, clearly. There's just a whole lot of stuff that this fascistic force has displayed, done, failed to do, that are clear indications about the really unacceptable spirit that's running this party. And if people saw that, they'd be motivated to repudiate that party. IVF, the Dobbs decision, but also some of the language that Trump uses, like poisoning the blood and bloodbath and not human. And there are a lot of ways of displaying the evil force, or this coherent force, this thing that we are engaged with. There is a two-sided battle going on, which is going to be fought out in an election. That force on the right gives us a huge treasury of ways of building a picture. I've got my own ways of trying to build that picture, but I don't know what will meet people somehow in a way that moves them. I read something this morning on Daily Kos, which was kind of sobering to me in terms of what do I know about the minds of the people out there that I'm hoping will get some mental furniture moved. This guy it was a really good article. The fellow's name is D'Artagnan. He writes under that pen name. I was really impressed with the article. He shows that how little attention most Americans pay to politics. How a lot of things that for people like me and him, and I'm imagining probably anybody listening now, are front and center. Like the indictments of Trump and who's Speaker of the House. He tried to show, I think successfully, that, or at least he claimed and plausibly, that Americans really don't know much about anything that's going on. They aren't paying attention. they give as little attention to the news as they spend brushing their teeth, something like that. And he said he made a whole list of things that you would think anybody would have to know something about, like Ukraine or Trump getting indicted, or stuff like that. These are really big stories. He said that the only news item of the last several years that really registered that people kind of knew about was these Chinese balloons. I mean, I think I can trust this guy to be reporting something, but Chinese balloons? I mean, that wasn't all that important, was it? But apparently it caught people's fancy. And if that catches your fancy more than something like a former president of the United States being indicted on 91 counts, and the evidence being presented publicly, which shows beyond a reasonable doubt that he actually really did commit a lot of very serious crimes. Yeah, can I believe that people really don't know that? Well, he points to the fact that I put two things together. That if you look at the polls, it seems like about at least half the people are saying they're leaning toward voting for Trump. And yet, if you study, at least what I think I can see in the election data, you see evidence that maybe 2/3 of the American people really would repudiate this fascist thing if they saw it for what it is. And IVF seems to maybe have done that, but how fully do they conceptualize what they see? Is it just at the concrete level of I don't want somebody interfering with my IVF or my kid's IVF or something like that, or do they extend it and say any political force that would do this to us, that would intrude in this way upon our being able to live our lives the way we want to live them, is unacceptable. I don't know what the story is, but we saw in 2022 that there are a lot of winnable races for the Republicans that they lost. And consistently, the most MAGA candidates lost. So at least 5 to 7%, it looked to me when I studied the numbers, of people who would have voted for the Republican, if it had been an acceptable Republican, didn't want to vote for the likes of Herschel Walker or that guy Ozen, or that extremist in New Hampshire, and crazy Kari Lake in Arizona. There were Republicans who would peel off, and you would then win races. And that's without there being a whole campaign to educate a lot of the other decent, sane people who are not swept up into the fascistic force, who actually welcome having Donald Trump threaten these judges, rather than saying that's not how any decent American would ever behave. Likewise with what he did with E. Jean Carroll. But there are a lot of Republicans, and I know some of them, who wouldn't want to be of that spirit. They are not themselves of a fascistic spirit. So the nature of a campaign to get that additional bunch to move, it's a campaign of getting Americans, particularly those Republicans who would reject fascism if they saw that's what they were, what their party was representing, to see that And so I picture, because it involves a lot of people having to move a lot of mental furniture, I have argued in the past and will reiterate now my belief that the campaign has to go all out from now on. And I feel like the people on MSNBC and some of the people that they bring on to MSNBC have sort of gone up another gear. Like they are already acting on that. Start it now. And I read some Never Trump Republican types who put out something called The Bulwark. And they're very intelligent people that I'm enjoying agreeing with and admiring, because I've been more on the left, and somebody like Bill Kristol he's been on the side of what I've opposed at certain major junctures, like when the neocons took us to war. But they do a really good job in the battle to defend democracy against fascism. They're putting out a real desire to mobilize the parts of the Republican world that recognize that Donald Trump is a threat to what's most important about America. The kind of thing about America that brought Liz Cheney and Jamie Raskin to be valuable allies in the battle when they were on the January 6th committee. I like seeing these Republicans rising to defend our democracy, and they're calling for a lot of stuff to come from the right, and I think that they have a feeling like start now. I've talked about what's his name? Call it. He'll come to me. I hope. Names, always on names. That Trump's generals should join together to create events in which they get media attention to tell America what Americans should understand about this upcoming election being, what it is, a battle between democracy and fascism, however they would present it. But we know that John Kelly, and we could bring in the Secretary of State, maybe Tillerson, but in any event, sticking to generals, Mattis is Secretary of Defense, and Milley, who felt he had a need to protect the country against a president who might do something very destructive to keep himself in power. That they have said things about Trump which would be good to get trumpeted out to the country as impactfully as possible. I mean, one of the great things about the challenge of this campaign is that it is a creative challenge of the kind that I think any creative person who's at all in the business of fashioning advertisements, video propaganda, messages, to undertake to put out something into the world that will get the target audience, first of all, get on some place where the target audience is watching, present it in a way that reaches that target audience and moves them. I would think that it would be let 100 flowers bloom, that we could have a Ken Burns version of it. We could have a Steven Spielberg version of it. We could have Bill Kristol and his ilk's version of it. Somebody on Bulwark announced in an email that just before I came on the air or whatever we are, that Mitt Romney is resigning from the Senate and is going to go play a role in the Biden administration. And then listed some other major Republican figures. And I didn't have time to, read it carefully, but what came across was there are people who have been prominent Republicans who are prepared right now to send word to the Republican base that maybe will get some people's attention. I would really welcome that. Like I said, I ran for Congress out here, and I believe that my op-eds are written off by a whole lot of people in this conservative, red, Republican, Trumpy area as he's a liberal, so we don't even have to pay attention to him. Now, ever since the Bush administration, I've observed how if anybody begins to criticize the authority that the base has been trained to support, that person, even if they had just been a respected and honorable ally, all of a sudden becomes contemptible and an enemy. I could see that back when W was president. Like there was no way of getting through already. But sometimes people take a beating. The guy who wrote this article on daily costs, D'Artagnan, he said it's coming. It's coming, and there are a lot of people who haven't been paying any attention, who are ready to be shown. He thinks that a campaign can get people's attention and take people who have very vague senses of things to have much clearer commitment to voting to preserve democracy once they're shown. So I think that's the hope. We need to embark upon a campaign where everybody who has something they can contribute, and it could be writing a check for a lot of people, contributes what they can, because this is one of those all hands on deck moments. The consequences for future generations are so enormous that we're in the position that the Israelis frequently were in when they were being attacked from all sides in 1948, 1956, and then about to be attacked in 1967 and 1973. This is one of those times where ends that we would reap from putting out the very best campaign of which America is now capable, not prejudging at all, well, not much, what best might look like. I'm happy to have other people's genius figure out who these people are, how to reach them, create these messages that the billion-dollar Biden campaign is able to fund, for example. And that reminds me also of one of the reasons why all the rest of us are particularly called upon to rise to the occasion, to involve ourselves and not just be spectators of this thing in whatever way might make sense. And that's because Joe Biden is not the greatest of all time at being the champion in a battle like this. I think Biden has shown, I think he's run his administration the best that I can remember seeing an American administration run, from what I can tell, with a couple of mistakes like this Gaza mistake. But I think he's accomplished a lot. People just were amazed after 2 years in this situation where 40% of the country think he stole the election, and where the balance of power in the Senate enables schmucks like Joe Manchin and whatever the hell she is, like Kristen Sinema, to hold everything hostage. He ended up accomplishing a lot. Was that just luck? I don't think so. He didn't always conduct himself the way I want a fighter, but it's hard to quarrel with results. I think that Biden has been an excellent president. It's too early to say, but I don't know how much to weigh this Gaza thing. But other than that, I'd say he'd be in the top 15 presidents when the historians vote in 15 years or something like that. And I'm not too worried about his getting older. I am somewhat worried. But what I recognize is that when it comes to the ability to move people, he's no Jack Kennedy, if you remember that line from Lloyd Benson in a vice presidential debate in 1988 against Dan Quayle. And he's no FDR. FDR showed a magnificent ability to get the American people to move with him, both through the darkness of the Depression and then through the great challenges of a war of a global nature like no war had ever been. It would be nice to have a leader like that, but that isn't Joe Biden. He'll do his part, but he'll do his best. It will have effects when in 2022, when he went out and started talking about this is a vote to save American democracy. It looked like he moved, I'd say, about 5% of the vote. It worked. I don't know how many people an FDR waging such a campaign would move, but in any event, he's mediocre at best as a speaker, an orator, the kind of person that reaches into the heart and soul of the people listening to him and brings them to their feet with their faces radiant with excitement to achieve the mission he's put before them. We've seen that gift can be used for good or for ill. We could use a benign version of somebody who excites the mass of the American people. Not like what Hitler did in the square at Nuremberg, which is, just looking at that way of people behaving, of all being dressed the same and all giving the Sieg Heil at the same instant. That's not an image of human thriving. That's a fascistic spirit expressing itself, and it really means defeating the human spirit. And they went ahead and made the human world more broken. We need to have various kinds of creative abilities harnessed for this task. People will come to their own set of beliefs about how to understand what's there already and how that might be changed. People will have to compose their own works of art in the art of moving people so that they recognize that they're really on the side of the good and not on the side of the evil, because that is really where they're at. That's a very important part of how I perceive the situation in America today. I recognize that there is a lot of human goodness out there ready to vote for Donald Trump. I live in this area. I got to know people doing hundreds of hours of talk radio conversations with a lot of good people who articulated values that I believe they were quite sincere about. And I loved them for it. And I live among these people and I can see a lot of goodness. And I can see that they're prepared to go into the voting booth and give their support to something which is the opposite of what that in them that I really appreciated and loved and thought was real and experience is real in my day-to-day life as I deal with people here in the world. The conservative, Republican, Christian, somewhat fundamentalist, old-fashioned, traditionalist, Confederate culture that I moved out to in 1992 from inside the Washington Beltway has a lot of really good human things in it. I came to really appreciate that conservative America has its own quite respectable versions of the good. And I spent the 1990s trying to integrate what I thought was the truth that the liberal part of America has about a whole variety of issues, and the truth that I was discovering in my talk radio conversations that a lot of these people also had, and their commitment to some values that I may reach in a different way, but that I also shared. I mean, I'm not a Christian, but I appreciate the teachings that they try to live by. I don't make a fetish about the American Constitution exactly, but I appreciated the kind of patriotism that made them, in a sense, revere our founders as if that was a God-inspired moment. Well, I could represent what happened in Philadelphia in 1787 as a God-inspired moment. You know, I've had times in my life when I felt like there was something working through me, but they did accomplish something which moved humanity forward a very great deal. And if you want to call it miracle in Philadelphia, which is the name of a famous book about the convention, yeah, there was something kind of miraculous. And I appreciated that they got deeper into that kind of that level of reverence than I did as a real fan of the Constitution because I believe in the rule of law and I understand the problem of power that we need to solve. And there was a time back in the 1990s that the liberals were sort of ignoring, I would say, to an unfortunate degree, the importance of good character. And the conservatives I would talk with on the radio, it would come up in our conversations, their belief in the importance of character, things like integrity, but not only. And I agreed, and I felt that that what was called for was for the liberal America to integrate into its system of values greater respect for the importance of character than we were as the agents of the welfare state, or certain things that were showing up as problematic. I thought not everything that liberals were enacting was working out great. And that the conservatives really needed to absorb some of the truths that that the liberal side had that didn't get sufficient respect and honor and weight when the conservatives thought about those issues. And when I introduced each show I did, I would say, let's talk with each other as if we actually could learn something from each other. And I characterized the goal as taking the half-truths of each side and finding that higher truth at a level at which the contradiction, they no longer contradict themselves. They achieve a greater wholeness. And I talked about the problem of polarization when people, in their interactions, they push each other ever further away. Um, and I described that in an op-ed piece I had in the Baltimore Sun about polarization. That my interaction with my mom when I was driving was to make me, her keep continually cautioning me about what's happening on the road gave me the impulse to drive more recklessly. And I noticed in an interaction with my firstborn son, the more I got into my, let's stay on the task that needs to be done self, the more he got into his procrastinate self and how we drove each other in that direction. That's why I was looking at things in the 1990s. And I know that there is a lot of goodness there, which is why the book that I wrote at that time was published by MIT Press, had the subtitle, A Quest to Bridge America's Moral Divide. I thought it important for people to find that higher wisdom. And when you can't, at least to find the common ground where you can make such advances you could agree upon. Whereas the force on the other side, I was trying to counteract what Rush Limbaugh was doing, which was to create a toxic kind of divisiveness, where the listeners to Rush Limbaugh were being taught to regard liberals as baby killers and depraved and like pizza parlors and then Newt Gingrich is using Nazi techniques to pair liberal with abnormal. It's just a lot of ugly stuff rising. There's a lot of goodness on the right that's somehow been taken over by the force that is behind today's Republican Party. I see the base as the repository of fascism. They're the people who nominated Trump. They're the people who have insisted that the Republican Party make him their nominee. But the base itself was the creation of a force that preceded the base being by 2015 in a state of consciousness where good people would nominate a president who has shown himself to be exactly the wrong kind of person, contrary to all their values. Something very strange happened that I've been laboring to understand, with way less success than would satisfy me. But somehow, these good people are supporting a coherent force that's threatening to destroy American democracy, which they sincerely believe that they believe in our democracy. When the fascist party takes to the floor of the House, putting copies of the Constitution in their pockets, these people somehow think that they are indeed supporting people who really believe in the Constitution, when all the evidence all over the place is that no, they're not supporting the Constitution. In a dozen ways, they are attacking the Constitution. They are trying to change our American system of government into one in which many vulnerable peoples get disenfranchised, in which the political power is able to yield law enforcement as a weapon against its opponents, in which the federal bureaucracy is manned by political appointees who will take an oath to the Constitution, but it means nothing to them. Their real loyalty is going to be to the leader who's standing up to become president of the United States again, even though all the evidence shows that this guy is guilty of the most serious crimes in American history. Way more serious a betrayal of the nation than anything connected with Benedict Arnold. Good people can be shown evil. and and what's the word I'm looking for? Recoil from it, reject it. And as I said, the amount of material that the Republicans and Trump and this whole thing, including women whose lives have been, I won't say ruined, but who are really being oppressed by some of what this Republican Party has done. And this woman who went through a crisis in her life enough to know that what Alabama was doing to this other woman today was really wrong, and the Alabamans were moved to agree with her. There's all kinds of people who are in touch with a whole lot of things. I don't really know if you need to always deal at the immediate personal level. I don't know what you can bring to life in the minds of people for whom the Chinese balloons are the one news article that really lives in their consciousness. I don't know. I'd be interested to see how Michael Moore might answer that question. And I mentioned Steven Spielberg and Ken Burns, and there's just a lot of people who've got a lot of talent, and there's a lot of different ways of approaching this, and let's just go win this thing as big as we can. When I say show people what's evil, I have the thought that the word evil should never be used in any of these ads. And I've mentioned before that I don't know, I think I'm given a lot of thought to three major blockbuster trilogies that we've had, well, not trilogy in the case of Avatar, but real big blockbusters that really enact a battle between good and evil, and have been hugely successful with American audiences. And that success tells me something, I think, really fundamental about American people, which is that they are very responsive to engaging their passions in a battle of good against evil, in which they identify with the good and enlist their passions to reach the conclusion in which the force of evil has been defeated, whether that force of evil is the Emperor and the Death Star in the first Star Wars trilogy, or the evil were what you get in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, where these battles take place where a force of evil is rising to destroy the world in some fundamental ways. And these, what are they called, hobbits, who live in these little English shires, are called upon to play the role of heroes in saving the good against the victory of the evil. And they are aided by other forms of the good that form an alliance that together work to end up triumphant, and the force of evil recedes from the world. And then Avatar, which broke all kinds of box office records, and was extremely effective in enlisting people's hearts and souls in the preservation of what life and the blue people of that planet. What was the name of the planet? Well, it's getting destroyed by the military-industrial complex that is so violent and so greedy that it ends up leaving that sacred world smoldering, but ultimately victorious. But it's a more painful victory than in the Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, where at least I feel like at the end of both of those, good has triumphed over evil. And at the end of Avatar as well, good has triumphed over evil, but good is profoundly wounded in that battle. And we're engaged in one of those kinds of battle. I mean, I could map every single one of those battles in a meaningful way, whether it's Luke and his gang against Darth Vader, or Sully and the Blue people against the Machine people, or whether it's Frodo and Bilbo and their buddies and Merlin against these demons and orcs. I'm not a master of the Tolkien world, but you can see good versus evil. We can see it, and we engage in it because we are wired to find that a meaningful distinction. Right now, in America, we are in a battle which is of that nature. That has not generally been the case in American history. Nobody living in America now has ever lived in an America where that was the fundamental nature of the political battle. I actually do believe that you could likewise say that there was a battle going on in the 1850s where you could find a force of brokenness, a coherent force that consistently makes the human world more broken or worse. You could find it operating in the human world back in the 1850s. And there was a meaningful way in which that evolving battle mapped onto good against evil. And I believe that I have shown in earlier writings, you can Google the force that led us to civil war is back. In a meaningful way, the battle we're engaged in now is not just a battle between fascism and democracy. It can also be seen as a recapitulation of the same battle that was fought on the North American continent in a nightmare of a civil war from 1891 to 1861 to 1865, and inflicted such huge damage on the country in multiple ways that the country still hasn't recovered from it. That's another clue that there is a coherent force. In that essay, I lay out the parallels between what the Republican Party was doing at that time, with that time being 2014, which was before Donald Trump entered into the picture and added his own special blend of destructiveness to what was pretty clear to me in 2014 was to a very great extent, if we had the equivalent of facial recognition technology looking at the force at work on the American right in the period from 1992, taking control of the Republican Party and getting up to 2014, if we could see that, we would say, boy, haven't we seen that before? When we studied the 1850s and the means by which the spirit of the two parts of the country, and particularly the secessionist impulse in the South, to fight a civil war in order to preserve the empire of slavery, which Lincoln was not going to allow to expand, but he was going to let, okay, you guys got that region of the country, we're going to leave that there. But Lincoln wasn't going to let it expand if he had his way. And that was reason enough the Southerners thought to violate the rule of law and secede. Once you see how lawless the behavior of the South was, you get a big clue about how broken a thing that was. And there was a coherent force that was fighting to maintain slavery, that for whom domination was really at the core of the source of their power. It was the source of their wealth. It was something that they had managed to gain at the Constitutional Convention as a means of dominating the country for the first 70 some years. They were attached to dominating, and anything like subordination was seen through the prism of a culture that was built upon slavery. And they had an ethic of they're supposed to be good gentlemen and Christian people. And yet that had to be reconciled with the reality that the whole thing was based on domination for exploitative purposes. And that included seducing whites that were not really beneficiaries of the slave system. On the contrary, it was bad for them. Seducing them into think that it was their fight when it wasn't their fight. It was against their interest. You know, the Irish knew to go to the northern ports. They didn't want to come to the southern ports and have to get a wage that would be the result of their having to compete against slave labor. No, the whites were, but they were willing to be, the slave power was willing to manipulate the whites into thinking that Southern honor was at stake. And there's brokenness in this picture that you get of where the South was coming from that led to the Civil War. And the brokenness there took over the country's destiny in a very destructive way. Partly because there really was a profound issue that needed to be settled. The country had been fighting over this thing for, there's a Missouri Compromise in 1820. There were compromises every couple decades, and kept on trying to patch over. There being a battle for power here, and then the South, I think, I may be wrong here. I think the South panicked when it recognized that the tide of history was moving against them. So they didn't want to be tethered to the North anymore when the North was going to be calling the shots more. And when they had the experience of being dominant in that arena too, with most of the presidents, most of the speakers of the House, most of the people on the Supreme Court coming from slave states. And then Abraham Lincoln gets elected. But it's a lack of integrity when you treat your election as being legitimate, and the election of your opponent is not being legitimate. You know, when people say these days to the Republicans, I think the line is, and I'm not too fond of this articulation, you don't love America only when you win. I don't think that's the word. Basically, you don't have a right to treat only the elections you win as legitimate. I don't know if that's the right way of putting it either. That captures it for me. So the South lost in 1860. The Trumpites lost in 2020. Each in its own way refused to accept that sometimes you win and sometimes you lose. That is the heart of the Constitution. And seceding without taking the issue to the Supreme Court was essentially a criminal act. And then you just sort of parallel all these various forms of brokenness that you can find. You know, Thomas Jefferson talked about essentially, he didn't call it brokenness, but that how being the master of slaves, of other human beings, treating them as livestock, which he did his whole life, by the way, has a terrible effect on the character of a human being. That terrible effect, I think, could be described in terms of yet one more form of brokenness, this force of brokenness that takes over the country at certain eras. The fact that that force of brokenness is just like, as you can see if you read that piece, what drove this country to civil war and all the destruction that inflicted on everybody, is also what's been at work on the political right. the I talk about the political right. Now, I'm not even imagining that anybody who thinks that Trump is great and worthy of support is listening to me. Um, what I know about right wingers, having interacted with them for 20 some years as best I could, for well, not 20 some years. When I had my website, I had a lot of conversations. I had difficulty ever finding one that was willing to deal with facts and logic the way that I think you have to if you want to find the truth. But anyway, if that's where you're at, well, thanks for listening to me. But let me say something that really that both sides um, are responsible for this disease. And I mean that. There, the virus of evil, as I'll call it, or brokenness or whatever, destructiveness, is gaining power through the right, through conservative America. That part of America is what it owns and controls. And I've watched it gain control over the last, let's see, when did I become aware? 1991, maybe 1992 for sure. And then 2004, a real moment of epiphany of a dark kind. And then I joined the battle full time. While that force was rising, it was rising by doing a variety of things that call out to be punished, but instead getting rewarded for it. It was behaving in ways that there was an important part, at first, an important part of a once respectable Republican Party that didn't want that. But then they saw that it was successful to do it. One place that comes to my mind is I could see it when in the first year of Biden's presidency, many Republicans came into office with Biden's presidency. I don't mean new to office, but when Biden's presidency began, a lot of the people in Congress of a Republican sort, I could see were sort of waiting to see how this is going to play out and acting like they were ready to act like a normal party because they were afraid of what Obama might do to them if they failed the country. And there were other Republicans when Obama wanted to get health care passed. There were other Republicans who were already acting in the fascistic way of we're going to make a priority to make this president fail rather than respect the outcome of the election where this is the guy that the American people had hired. We're going to make him a failure so that we can get more power. No sense of responsibility for the greater good. Very telltale. They were afraid, a lot of Republicans, as I saw. Chuck Grassley comes to my mind. I was watching him do his dance about health care, and I think he was ready to act like a normal member of a normal Republican opposition and work with the president in some way to get something done. Because he thought that Obama, who came in with really high he had this charisma about him. He was the guy that 100,000 people in Berlin, Germany, screamed with enthusiasm. And then Grant, this was our deliverer. He had enormous potential power if he knew how to use it. But the people who were going to make him fail, which they decided, a bunch of them, at the very beginning, even before he took the oath of office, they were not punished. Obama did not make them pay a political price for behavior that needs to be punished. Instead, they succeeded in hurting Biden. By the time he had 2 years left in his second term, they had completely emasculated him. He had no ability to accomplish anything through Congress. All he could do was run foreign policy and do executive actions. Why is it the rest of liberal America didn't see that he had retreated to a huge degree that presidents should never have to retreat? And he retreated because he was like the rest of liberal America, the ones who didn't recognize that Obama had forfeited some battles that he could have won. I mean, he was really good when he decided to throw a jab, but he just didn't do it much at all. Just often enough to remind you, geez, if he were to put his mind to it, he could make these guys pay a price. So the Republicans are able to run in 2010 and 2014 and give the Biden side a shellacking because the American people are punishing the Democrats for not getting more accomplished when it is the Republicans who are conspicuously doing everything they can, indefensibly, to get anything accomplished. So in addition to what's happening on the right, there's a real need to recognize that something is not happening on the liberal side, something that needs to be happening. The liberal side is that if one, we have a two-party system. If one party goes rogue over to the dark side, we have one more party that we depend upon to defend the system. That's just the way the American system is set up. We don't have a third party that's going to save us. It's like the virus is the evil part. And then we've got the good part with an immune system that somehow doesn't respond appropriately to the presence of the virus. Now, I wrote a book, the MIT book, called the subtitle, A Quest to Bridge America's Moral Divide. I tried to act out in that book, which has a lot of different voices, sort of like what Plato might have done with America's Moral Divide. I tried to act out the conversation that I thought would, it's the best job that I was able to do to show how we might talk with each other and end up with with enough common ground that we could defeat some of the forces that are dividing us and move America forward in a good way with a clearer understanding of what it is we're dealing with and what it takes to build a good human world. I didn't at that time, when I'm talking about bridging America's moral divide, that was based on my experience on the radio, where I felt like we were able to do a fair amount of meaningful, constructive dialogue. I'm not saying that the bridge got fully constructed, but we moved in that direction. And then subsequent to that book's publication in 1999, what happened on the right was some changes that changed the nature of the interaction, that bad faith had left what it was that we had to contend with. Me on the radio with the conservative culture that's been here for generations, they were still the good conservatives that you might have found on the town square in the 20s on the 4th of July. There was a basic continuity, but by 2004, the Republican Party had been taken over by a different spirit, and good people had gone over with it somehow. The George Bush, the father, is a guy who writes wonderful thank you notes, was so gracious in what he left for Clinton. I know that there's a case to be made about there was a place of fascism at work in that first Bush administration. But the basic conservative decency of this scion of of Connecticut aristocracy melded with Texas political hardball, it still had a whole lot of decency in it. By the time we get to W, the party's been taken over. And liberal America hadn't noticed what was taking over. So you get the sort of like AIDS being what's wrong with the liberal side, a compromised immune system, and then the HIV virus being what's taken over the right because the immune system hasn't done its job. Hold on a second. I'll be right back. Something happened. So when I think about the campaign we must run, my concern is that we will not be strong enough in our messaging, that the fearfulness that liberal America has shown in the past to call lies lies and whole list of things that we've not called out for what they were. My fear is that that kind of weakness is just too set into the liberal America. We might get actually the kind of strength, like Liz Cheney. Liz Cheney has come out there like a really good fighter, from the beginning. When she served on the January 6th committee, she was a fighter. It was interesting to see that. I think Jamie Raskin came across as a fighter too. But I think that if you look at the people who have spoken with most out there not abandoned. There was nothing abandoned about Liz Cheney. And I wouldn't mind if she was to speak even more boldly. And I hope that Mitt Romney is going to speak boldly. I think that the conservatives are the best people for reaching the conservatives. Not leave it only to them, but they are a special forces unit, I think. People like John Kelly and the other generals. I saw Judge Ludig, who's a conservative judge that everybody introduces as he's retired, but he was the darling of the right wing, as judges go, back when the right wing had any integrity and any commitment to the rule of law. And he's very high prestige, I gather. I wasn't aware of him before Trump appeared on the scene. But he testified to the January 6th committee that Donald Trump is a clear and present danger to American democracy and the rule of law and all that kind of stuff. Now, I saw him late last week, I think on Friday, on Nicole Wallace's show. And there was a big conversation about the way Trump continuously gets these gag orders and continuously launches these vicious attacks on people connected with the process of American judiciary and law enforcement holding him accountable, getting these gag orders, which are or are not sufficient, and getting, Ludig feels like that nobody's holding him accountable for what he's doing to legitimize the American people. He says nobody in a position to do so. I went and studied this. I saw it on Friday. I went and studied this morning just so I can remember what he said. He said nobody in a position to do so is doing anything about it. That's not maybe the right quote, but he was definitely saying, and then people got into talking about, well, Trump is out on bail. Any one of these judges could throw him in jail for violating the terms of bail, and nobody's doing that. Is that what Ludig was saying? Is he didn't? I was so frustrated. I don't know if you have that experience. I may be even giving you that experience. Like I want the interviewer to, ask him this, ask him this. I wanted to know because he said it several times that basically he's getting away with it and nobody can stop him. Is doing what they need to do to stop him. And I want to ask, what would you recommend? Whom to do? Is it putting him in jail? Then there was some conversation. Well, that'd be playing into his hands. He'd be a martyr. Well, I think that the system has erred in treating Trump better than anybody else would be treated. If the issue is, and I think Trump forced the issue to be this, that nobody is above the law, I think that the responsibility of all the decision makers here is to act in a way that continually establishes that nobody is above the law. I've heard legal authorities like Glenn Kirshner, for example, and Lisa Rubin on MSNBC say that anybody else doing what Trump's been doing would have had their bail revoked and it would be sent behind, found in contempt and sent to jail. And they're afraid that would play into his hands. But I say, let's look at what we've done for the last 30 years. Never too much, never too tough, always bending over backwards to be what? To treat Donald Trump, who has endangered the rule of law more than any other single human being in the history of the country, to give him better treatment at every turn. I mean, there are a lot of turns. I'm not going to try to, in each of these cases, people, I think there's probably more than a half a dozen places where what Trump got is better than what anybody else would have got. A lot of times you'll hear the people who are discussing this stuff that teach me about law. If I or you or any other American would have done this, we'd be in jail. I mean, a whole list of things, not just the gag order stuff. So I don't think there's a danger of being too tough. I think the problem is that there's something in the immune system that is weakening itself by shrinking from the fight when the fight must be pressed. If you go to my website, betterhumanstory.org, you'll see as you scroll down, basically my mission is to get that set of ideas, that coherent way of understanding not only our own present situation, but the whole nature of the human story, because we stepped onto the path of civilization. If you go there, I lost my way. If you go to betterhumanstory.org, you'll find a lot of stuff. Stuff that's geared toward trying to touch the minds and hearts of the good conservative people I live among. But also stuff like that book back there, What We're Up Against, the destructive force at work in our world and how we can defeat it. That was my attempt to get something out in 2015 before we stepped into what I've had this intuition was going to be a disaster for the country in the 2016 election. The only way I could get it out was to self-publish it. That book's out from the University of California Press and SUNY Press. That book is my one venture into self-publication. And I didn't really get any attention with it. I didn't understand how much I would cripple myself by self-publishing, but it was my effort. And we had election in 2016, and we're still dealing with the really adverse consequences of it. A Better Human Story shows that the larger battle has to do with some coherent forces that it turns out you can see the inevitability of these forces emerging if you look carefully at the history of our species, going back into primate and onward to hunting, gathering into civilization. If you look at that history through an evolutionary perspective, you can see something that puts a lot into a very different light. It clarifies just a whole lot. I mean, I've devoted my life to that part's the foundational idea, but there's more. That's why I'm a man on a mission. If you take that step, you will unleash a destructive force, inevitably. It's got to do with the fact that that step is unprecedented in the history of life on this planet or on any other planet where some other creatures started on the path of civilization, which I define as the societies created by a creature that extricates itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically, by inventing its own way of life. It's a new thing. Evolution for 3.5 billion years was creating a certain kind of order, which is important to look at. It's one thing to say, yeah, I understand natural selection and Darwin, but evolution, not Genesis. But important to realize that the nature of evolution is that it creates a certain kind of order. And if you don't see that it creates a certain kind of order, you don't recognize that fateful step of extricating yourself from the niche in which the creature evolved biologically means leaving that order, which means entering into a new kind of disorder. I've done this, showing this before, but the point is that disorder inevitably, I claim to demonstrate, haven't found a hole in the argument in over 50 years. That disorder creates a social evolutionary force that isn't a function of the nature of the creature. It's a function of the dynamics of the system, which evolutionary perspective shows you got something new here. There are going to be consequences to that newness. And the consequence is that there's going to be an evolution of civilization, so that what's shaping it is a selective process for not a random pick of what cultural options will prevail and spread. Not the things that people would choose, but the ones that can prevail in the disorder of anarchy, which generates a war of all against all. What can prevail in a war of all against all? Anyway, I can show that a destructive force emerges with civilization. So that any creature that actually takes that step, I don't know anything about life elsewhere, but I read science news all the time, and I've encountered something about the vastness of the universe, the billions of galaxies and the billions of stars in every galaxy, and all the planets that they're finding out that our sun is not unique in the least for having a bunch of planets. So I'm imagining that there are a lot of planets out there where life evolved. It just seems the numbers of possible planets is so huge. How could it not be? I could be wrong. Maybe this is so unique a situation that even one out of quadrillions, we're lucky. I don't know. There's a lot about this planet that's special. I do understand, but how rare can it be to have something that life could get a foothold on? And then as it evolves, given, I don't know how rare it would be to be able to develop multicellular organisms and various interlocking kingdoms of life and getting ecosystems and ultimately a biosphere. It seems to me that's what would happen if life got started on a planet where it could get a foothold. Maybe I'm wrong. And then if you're given enough time, and why wouldn't you have enough time? We're talking about if you got life evolving for billions of years, how unusual is it going to be that eventually you're going to create a creature that's got a kind of creative intelligence that's been essential to its mode of adaptation, and that it becomes the world's first significantly cultural creature because it's developed a brain that can invent culture and transmit it from generation to generation, and gradually you can say that primate bands evolve over some millions of years, not huge number of millions, into hunting-gathering bands. And there's some uncertainty about how much culture was there, how early. But I find myself reading the literature as a casual student, but a regular student of this stuff. I think that culture gets to be pretty important, a couple of million years. And I think in the last 700,000 years, it's still gathering momentum, and you don't have to get all the way to civilization, where we've got a creature that's got culture playing a very important role in its life. But still, in the niche in which it evolved biologically, in other words, hunting-gathering bands, and go back several million years to something that's not so human. But they're still living much the same way. And then this growing brain that I don't know when it reaches its full human capacity. Are they saying 300,000 years or even more? I don't know. But that human brain keeps on being able to invent stuff. Because, that's what we're better at than any other animals on the earth. We're the cultural animals. We do paintings and stuff like that on walls. I mean, elephants have got a fair amount of stuff going on, but I'm not aware of their creating artworks. And there's some proto-languages in the animal world, but nothing like what we can see hunting-gathering peoples have had. But for whatever reasons, at a certain point, that inventive capability gets used to change the rules of the life. It starts to create a different form of life, one that's been invented by the creature, not one that's been selected for by natural selection. A major point in discontinuity in the history of life on that planet. And then, as I said, these entities exist outside of any order that's going to regulate how they interact with each other. Whereas I say about the old order, the evolved order, the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. About this interacting system of civilized societies, and inevitably, there's going to be a problem of power that emerges because there is no order to govern how they're going to interact. There's going to be a war of all against all. And the things that can prevail in a war of all against all are quite non-random. I mean, it's like biological evolution. but it's something emerging suddenly onto the world, into disorder. A new kind of thing, a new form of life, a civilizing society, a civilized society, empires, agriculture, something where it is stuff that the creature itself invented rather than got built into it over the course of generations, countless generations, in interaction with the rest of the system of life. If you look at I believe that to my satisfaction, I basically prove a few things. Um, I prove that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large. And I would say that I can prove that when we look around the world right now and see all the ugliness, Ukraine and Gaza, we're seeing a very distorted picture of humankind that was inevitable, because we inevitably got swept up into the selective force that was shaping our human civilization, inevitably, because of the anarchy. Anarchy leads to the selection for the ways of the warlord, the gangster, inevitably. So there's a lot more ugliness out there right now. I mean, if I look at, there are some human monsters out there who are, if you were to make a triptych or something like, who on this planet is having the greatest impact on sort of the careening path that civilization's on? Well, I would have to include Trump, Putin, and Netanyahu in that list. We could say that Biden's belongs on that list. But isn't it the case that, I don't know if Hamas has got one single master chess player that set the trap for the Israelis, or if it's a group or whatever. Anyway, I think if you were to make a list of the four most influential people on the planet, and would you include the Pope? I don't think so. I like the guy very much. And over the years, I have felt his goodness. Not everything he's done lately, but he's getting pretty old. But no, I don't think he's as influential as Netanyahu or Putin, for sure, Putin. I mean, Netanyahu is messing up the whole world, but he's mostly messing up a piece of the world that's been very troubled for a very long time. And a lot of people have been very hungry to make progress. And these Abraham Accords, and eventually maybe it's going to be get Saudi Arabia on board so that we would have Israel sort of working its way into a peace with the surrounding world, leaving the Palestinian issue not adequately addressed in any meaningful way, because Netanyahu has prevented it. And because the Israeli people are having trouble with that. And because the Palestinian people are not the most attractive, offering the most attractive set of options of who to deal with. But certainly Putin and Trump. I mean, the Middle East is really important, so I guess I want to include Netanyahu too. And these three guys are human monsters. You'd have to be a human monster to, I mean, the one I would hesitate most about calling a human monster is Netanyahu. He's a sociopath. Uh, I'm not sure he goes as far as Trump into malignant narcissism. He's just narcissistic. He's willing to damage his country for his own selfish purposes, like Trump is. But Trump is just sort of so uniformly destructive. Netanyahu just shares his utter selfishness and lack of commitment to decency. The lack of the ability to give sufficient weight to the legitimate rights and interests of other human beings. Trump with E. Jean Carroll, Netanyahu and his gang with their willingness to level Gaza to this extent, without even countervailing it with really meaningful gestures about settler violence in the West Bank. Human monsters, 3 out of 4. Yeah, it's no wonder we human beings have really thought of ourselves as pretty lousy creatures. When people say, well, that's human nature, they're always pointing to some defect. Looking around the human world, like Dickens did, he comes up with all these ways in which people can be broken. All these caricatures of our flaws. But he's also characterizing the social order in which these people are born, into which they're born, and in which these people rise up. I don't know that, I don't think that Dickens was aware that the brokenness in the human world was so much the consequence of a social evolutionary dynamic that inevitably arose with civilization and that continually selected for what prevails in a world filled with the brokenness of a war of all against all. So any creature, I say, and I believe that to my satisfaction, I've proved it. Well, I keep on looking for, well, what if the circumstance were this or that? But I think it is inevitable that any place civilization emerges, people will have to contend with this, with a coherent force that consistently makes their world more broken, that spreads a pattern of brokenness through that creature's world by inflicting brokenness from level to level through as history moves through time. War, suffering, trauma, societies that have been shaped by the needs of power that you have to internalize their morality, which leads to the brokenness of a war between what society says we're supposed to be and what our nature calls out for us to be. There's a lot to be said about human nature. But in any event, I don't claim to know what human nature is, but I can prove that it is not as ugly as the pages of our history. That any creature anywhere that started inventing civilization would get swept up inevitably into this inexorable process where a destructive force has arisen in the center of its drama and spreading a pattern of brokenness through time in shape-shifting ways, greed and suffering and conflict and injustice and hatred, and all these forms of brokenness feeding each other through time. Because you started with that original brokenness of a disordered system, inevitable. So there's going to be a kind of a race going on, because I can also, I think, compellingly argue, let's just say, I'll stop short of prove, because this idea isn't 50 some years in being put through the ringer by me. It's, how long has it been? I don't know, 5 or 6 years, about the fate of human civilization. I've tried to envision what it would mean on some other planet with some other species, that they eventually get to the point where there's somebody with the creative intelligence to extricate itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically and start to control the ecosystem that they used to, that had previously shaped them, as selection continually selected for what can survive in this circumstance over what cannot. and nothing can win against its environment, so you create an order. Okay. A creature gets selected for having an internal nature that in the ancestral past contains those behavioral tendencies that led to survival better than might have been the case with somebody who didn't have those behavioral tendencies. That's what selection's about. What can get their DNA into the future? So the evolutionary perspective, on the one hand, can show that something like Trump and the force of fascism and the force of the slave power and the force that took over Germany out of the 20s into the 30s and for a 12-year period ran the country and damaged the whole world, is going to come up against a different kind of force that can also be seen through an evolutionary perspective. Now, the evolutionary perspective says about the force of brokenness that it's got to do with escaping from the evolved order into a disorder that is about brokenness, and brokenness begetting brokenness through the millennia even. But the evolutionary perspective has a different way of showing what the drama is at the center of the human story. Namely that I can argue, I think with compelling logic, that if there is something, an experiential tendency that we're born with, and I think I can show a variety of such, but particularly experience some things in better terms of better and some of worse, and a capacity for, and in terms of the pursuit of happiness, that it's in there because it was conducive to the survival of our kind. Those who had that experiential tendency, which led them to behave in ways that were survival enhancing, out survived those that didn't. It wouldn't be there if it wasn't for that. So we do have some things in us that evolution created that, at least in the ancestral past, helped motivate people to do what they needed to do to survive and produce offspring that would survive to produce offspring. And that's not random stuff. There is, in a sense, a source of guidance that's life-serving, that takes various forms, or there are, I think maybe it does take various forms, but I talk about it in different categories, in terms of value and in terms of spiritual, the capacity for a particular kind of experience that we might call spiritually transformative, and the pursuit of happiness, and some other experiential tendencies that I don't feel like I fully understand, but I do have a case for why we get pleasure from beauty. That it's all got to do with those things having been life-serving. And then you just ask yourself, well, what does it mean if it's life-serving? If you've got an experiential tendency on the basis of which you can, in a philosophically responsible way, build a moral dimension, what does that say? Well, I think it says that the moral dimension is real, important, and life-serving. And we in America right now are having to make a decision about whether good or evil. And I think that the choices map rather well over a coherent force that which would be good, and a coherent force on the opposite direction of brokenness, when it's going to be evil. I think good v evil is a pretty good way of approximating the nature of the political battle in America right now. And I've been saying that since 2004. I think people are ready to see it because they've given us so many ways of showing evil. And again, I think that one of the interesting creative challenges for the campaign that should be run is that messages be composed that are able in some way to convey at least three, maybe as many as five images of what it is that's on the ballot, basically in terms of democracy versus fascism, or Trump versus Biden, or however you want to put it. I mean, they're all essentially this same dichotomy. That you show something that people will respond to in a way that we do, like respond to the Death Star and the Emperor. Oh, revulsion. We recoil from this evil, and we love Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we love Merlin, and we hate whatever the countervailing guy was. And we love the world in which Sully and this beautiful blue girl that have fallen in love with each other under this sacred bush, they are able to essentially, in the blue people way, form a indissoluble romantic and I dare say sexual bond of some kind. We are with that, with all our hearts. And we are against these bulldozers that bulldoze the beautiful living system that we have seen as so sacred. They don't have to use the word evil. So I would like to see, I don't know, can you do three different images that give different experiences of evil without using the word in a 30-second spot? Do you need a minute to be able to show evil without? Anyway, that's a genre that I'd be interested in. I'd like to know what some really creative people can do. Putting ads on television networks that'll be watched by the kind of people who will respond to seeing that evil, will be moved in some way. I mentioned on Saturday, I've just seen Spielberg's movie Amistad, and he really knows how to bring evil to life so that it tears you apart to see the beautiful human beings being brutalized. Yeah, I mean, he's a child of the Holocaust generation, and he's maintained his sensitivity. I'd like to see what he could do with Trump. In Schindler's List, he has this picture, this segment where these Jews have not yet been sent to death camps. What's the name of the place? Tarienbad or something like that. It's on Czech soil, and it's virtually, it's compared to what they would go to in Auschwitz. It's like a hotel, but it's still human cruelty. And then Spielberg brings these big German Shepherd police dogs that are being wielded by these SS troops that are rounding them up. He knows how to convey. He knows how to convey the terror that we never want visited on innocent people by the fascist force. I don't know what he'd do, but I would love to see it go all out now. We need to get those people to see that. And on the other side of the political spectrum, not the people who might vote for Trump, but the people who hate Trump but might not vote for Biden. Or if they don't hate Trump, they've got a way of looking at politics so that what they feel like doing because they want to vote their conscience will pick out some third-party candidate that stands for what they believe in more somebody who is in some sense put out a message that makes him more of a hero than Joe Biden is because of whatever. I had a video, I think it was Saturday, that those who realize that Donald Trump must lose, and if you believe in the good, then you believe in maintaining American democracy, which means you believe in Donald Trump not getting to be president. And the only way that's ever going to happen is if Joe Biden wins the election. That is, there are only two possibilities. And there are people who like to ignore the fact or not give sufficient weight to the fact that at the end of this campaign, barring some act of God or whatever, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden will be elected president. We don't have the we should not have a conscience which indulges us in voting for something because we think it's a more noble thing than the other thing that we could vote for, when the other thing is the only other thing besides Trump that might be wielding the powers of the presidency in January of 2025 and for 4 years. We don't have that luxury. The stakes here are just so ultimate that there's only really one responsible choice. You simply, if you know that Trump must lose, then you know you must vote for for Joe Biden. Not voting for Donald Trump is half as valuable in terms of the outcome of the election as not voting for Donald Trump and voting for Joe Biden. I saw on TV the other day a former Republican member of Congress who's one of those Republicans who maybe will go out there and he was disgusted with Republicans who will say stuff about Trump that so clearly means therefore you got to vote for Joe Biden, but they don't say it. He seemed to be ready to forgive Lynn Cheney for never saying it, and maybe he forgives them all, but I don't think he was forgiving of them all. But it might be the case that that there's a time to begin drawing that conclusion. First, you got to wear down people into understanding that Donald Trump simply must lose. And then maybe when they've been sitting with that idea for a few months, then you can come out with, you remember that the essential thing in this election is that Donald Trump and all those people who have dishonored themselves by aligning themselves with this democracy destructive mission that Trump's been on, that they must lose. And that means, I sure hope that we would hear this from a lot of Republicans, that they should vote for Joe Biden, and they should give Joe Biden a Congress controlled by, not in which the Trump party is not in a position to interfere with the people's business getting properly done. By the way, I've been thinking that a big part of a Biden campaign should be reelect me, and give me a Congress that will work with me, a Democratic-controlled Congress, and then to lay out a list of popular things that he would promise to deliver. Give me another 4 years, give me a Congress that's like this and not like that, and I will submit this to Congress and they will enact it. I don't know if anybody's doing that. I imagine that there are a lot of things that they could enact. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in that Build Back Better thing that they had to throw overboard when Manchin and Sinema threw monkey wrenches in. And having to, we need to get rid of the filibuster because it's been abused so much. We need to do something about the debt ceiling because that's been abused so much. And there's a whole list of things that I'm not really competent to prepare, but there must be a bunch of stuff that if Joe Biden had a Congress that where the Democrats functioning with as much unity as they showed in the first 2 years of his life, his presidency, his first term, if he had a Congress that could act with that much unity and had that much numerical advantage in the whole in both houses of Congress, there must be some really appealing stuff that could get passed. People are frustrated that we keep on fighting the same damn fight again and again and again. Aren't there still some fights? Are there some good changes to Obamacare that people would say, yeah, that would be good on insulin or whatever? Ukraine aid, I don't know if you can get the American people excited about that. You can sell what they've already done, of course, but there's still more stuff to do. A Voting Rights Act that will reverse some of the disenfranchisement and gerrymandering, if you can get that through Congress. Get rid of the filibuster. There must be a whole lot of things that I think another one, background checks and a few other common sense gun things. Can't we get more votes than we lose by saying, I will propose this and this and this, which are quite reasonable gun legislation that is quite consistent with the Second Amendment, properly understood, and achieves a reasonable balance between the public interest and the public safety on the one hand and the rights of gun owners on the other. Can't we come up with something that people would be glad for? I think that the polls always show the majority, and also on the issue of abortion, the polls are showing that what the right wing has been doing is not what the American majority wants. So I think there should be a package that's getting sold and saying, vote Democratic from the president on down, and this is what will get accomplished. Okay, I think I'll bring that all to an end. There's always more to talk about. I'll just say that what I try to do in these things, when I don't know exactly where I'm going or what I'm going, the improvisational nature of the thing, I write in a very systematic way. If I say I think I argue compellingly, it's all very planned. And if you go to my website, abetterhumanstory.org, but it would take a little while because a lot of pieces get put together. But if it matters to you to understand that some of these things are true about the nature of the battle that we are engaged in, and then it'd be worth the work. But also, there's another thing, which is if I only dealt with one piece of this integrated picture at a time, there would be never a time when I show there are a lot of things that are connected here. And so I'm trying to sort of enact that connectedness. So I give up the systematic argument, logic and evidence and reason. To some extent, I give it up in order to show that there is a picture here that's integrated. There are some coherent forces here that we're dealing with. If we want to win this battle, meaning save American democracy and also for human civilization to survive for the long haul on this planet, it is good to be able to see the whole picture. And you don't have to go read it at abetterhumanstory.org. Just follow me, and there will be a whole sequence of these kinds of excursions where we look at what's happening in the immediate thing, like the trials of Donald Trump and the nature of the fascist regime in Moscow and how that connects with the empires that rose inevitably when civilization first emerged full blown on this planet, say 5,000 years ago, all connected. So make a lot of connections in a variety of ways over time, and perhaps make it plausible to the viewer. Maybe there are some connections there. I wonder how else they all get shown to be one coherent picture of what happened to our species because we became the civilization creating species. And what that implies about the nature of the challenge that we face and what kind of creatures we are. Now, I believe that it puts all those things into a rather different light, and an importantly different light, in ways that could help us be fortified, knowing that we're better creatures than we thought we were, for starters, but also having a clearer understanding of the nature of the battle and how it needs to be fought. Nothing simple, but still a clearer view. And if you don't understand the nature of the battle, you're likely not to be fighting it in the most effective way. So that's what I'm trying to do. I'm a man on a mission because I really do believe that if enough people saw what I think I can show, that change in how we think about things would lead to better strategies, more moral and spiritual passion behind those strategies, and a deeper commitment to making sure that life defeats death, good defeats evil, democracy beats fascism. Today's Democratic Party must defeat today's Republican Party. And Biden has to defeat Trump. And they're all linked together. And we're in a place in our social evolution where we've developed, as we can see, the capacity to destroy ourselves. In a nuclear holocaust, because the power of culture continually will increase. That's kind of inevitable. Should I go into that? We're creatures, obviously, to be civilized. We have to be cultural. We have to have the capacity to transmit things from generation to generation. In general, the whole process is likely to make that civilization more and more powerful in a variety of ways, one of which is the weapons of war, especially given that the emergence of civilization inevitably creates a war of all against all. Inventiveness will definitely play a big role in developing more powerful weapons, and iron displaces bronze and stuff like that. And then you eventually get, if you got time, if the power of the weapons is continually growing with some setbacks or whatever, or with or without setbacks, but eventually you're going to cross a line where the power of the weapons means you could destroy your planet. And we reached that point in 1940, whatever you want to call it. And we went through a Cold War where we really had a possibility of ending the human story right then and there, in 1962 in particular. But we also, our society is also going to develop more and more powerful technologies as time goes on. As the civilization creating creature is able to, harness various forms of energy, for example, where you go from windmills and water mills back 1,000 years ago to eventually developing the steam engine and the internal combustion engine and jet engines and the ability to manufacture things using fossil fuels to get a whole lot of things done and harnessing electricity. Eventually, you end up with a civilization like ours that can support 8 billion people using increasingly powerful technologies, which we can see can really upset the ecological apple cart, as we can see with climate change. Who knows how catastrophic what we've already put in motion might be. But if a civilization is continually growing in power with occasional setbacks like the fall of the Roman Empire or whatever, eventually it will cross the line into being able to destroy itself. I think it's useful to understand that as soon as we became a civilization creating creature, we were bound to find ourselves in the position that we now conceive that we're in, which is we face that inevitable challenge for a creature that's essentially left the order of biologically evolved nature of ordering our disordered civilization well enough, soon enough, that it can survive for the long haul on this planet and survive in a way which is consistent with the viability long term of the planet itself, the rest of life on Earth, from which we emerged and on which we probably will always have to be somewhat dependent for our own survival. Can we order ourselves, our civilization? It was inevitable that we would descend into this anarchy. But as the civilization evolves through history, the ability to order the civilization also will increase as we get things like international law and law of the sea and hydrofluorocarbons and maybe some treaties and certain ways of trying to eliminate the anarchy, but not adequate at all now, as we can see from what Putin could do in Ukraine. We would inevitably reach the point where we need to I don't. I think you could probably say inevitably, wherever civilization emerges, it'll be destructive of the ecological system or the biosphere to some extent, as we certainly have been for thousands of years. You know, soils denuded and deserts spreading and forests cleared, and all kinds of things that we've done to this planet, but never. As our power grew in the industrial and post-industrial age, and we've got now such a huge civilization with such power, we've reached the point where we really can do to this planet what an asteroid. It took a huge asteroid to do 66 billion years ago, million years ago. I'm sorry, which is to render a lot of most species extinct. So, ordering our civilization is something that was eventually going to have to be done. There was going to be a race between, is that destructive force going to make things so broken that we can't get it together? Might be. Maybe I'm an optimist when I say I think it's a toss-up. Or are we going to be able to get a handle on what we're up against? Whoops, that's what we're up against. To see the force that emerged with civilization inevitably, that's given us the spirit of the gangster, having too much of a voice in how civilization is shaped, and then how it acts. Like Putin, Hitler, Trump. I hope Xi doesn't decide to continue that pattern by attacking across the Taiwan Straits. There are a lot of dangers that lurk in front of us. We got to get our act together here. And that's what I feel that I offer in A Better Human Story, is at least an understanding of the force we're up against and the challenge that we face as a species, and how to perceive what we are and where we are in the social evolutionary process. I don't know if we would grade ourselves as having done poorly, but it was never going to be easy. We fell into a really injurious force with the selection for the ways of power, out of the war of all against all. What can prevail? The gangsters. And we're all broken by it. I mean, I don't know what the world would look like if somehow there had never been a force of brokenness shaping our society. I don't know what, with our inventiveness, how wonderful a world would we have been able to create. But I think we could have done a whole lot better. And if we can bring this destructive force that's been there since the beginnings of civilization, and that has Donald Trump as one of the star players in that drama because he's so broken. We, if we can stop that force and bring it under control by fighting this fight with all of our strength, which means also tapping into moral and spiritual passions, which the secular worldview, which does admit that Darwin was better than Genesis in saying how we got here, doesn't have some of the important things that the religious point of view used to give us that can be reached in a purely secular way, which is what I'm trying to provide. I can show that there is such a thing as value and that there is such a thing as a spiritual dimension which needs to be honored. Evolution put these things there. And we can, we're challenged to make use of what evolution put into us to adapt to a world which is very different from the one we evolved in, which creates some challenges in terms of we're not entirely adapted to dealing with the kinds of problems that we face here in the 21st century. And these experiential tendencies that make us behave in ways that go for the good and that are open to spiritual truth were not formed at a time when we were dealing with all the stuff that we deal with as a modern civilization. But I think the fundamentals are still the ones that are life-serving. I think that people basically do prefer peace to war, love to hate, generosity to greed, kindness to cruelty. I think that those are all built into us to value. And I don't think that it's necessarily easy to invent a civilization which allows all those better sides of the dichotomies to prevail. But I think that we human beings can be pretty well counted on to want those things to prevail. And geez, if we can invent some of the things that we invent and have, we can have scientists that can devise equipment that can put, tons of pressure onto something so that they can have a moment of fusion power being developed. I mean, that's just one example. I mean, people are able to do such extraordinary things. I think our values are basically such that the inborn values, that human beings would like to live in the world that Jesus' teachings tell us to live in. Do unto others, the golden rule, and reach for love thy neighbor as thyself. And I think that we all like to watch how Jimmy Stewart and Bedford Falls triumph over the alternative scenario of Pottersville and the greedy old rich man prevailing. We have an idea of what the world should look like. And we're so inventive and smart. I'm not sure there's any reason to think that if there weren't forces blowing us off course, we wouldn't figure out some way to develop a world in which the better parts of those dichotomies prevail and the worse are dealt with a whole lot more constructively. So that's the nature of our campaign right now. We need to be fighting in our own particular sphere right now to make sure American democracy prevails. We cannot afford for the world to lose the leader of the free world that we have been for all our shortcomings over to being the ally of the fascists in Moscow who invaded Ukraine. The chance of human civilization surviving would be greatly reduced if fascism takes over in this country. So let's take this battle as seriously as it warrants and tap into the moral and spiritual passions to fight it and go all out to do so. We can be a new greatest generation. Beating the same basic enemy that the people who fought the fascists of Berlin and Tokyo, but beating them in a political arena where the battlefield was the awareness of our fellow citizens. Let's wage this battle and win it. Thank you.